Aloha History 370. So prompt 2. First I'll talk about motives for Native Hawaiian migration. While the San Francisco Call article is light on details as far as motivations for migration, in Lecture 5, Professor talks about the shift from subsistence work to paid labor in Hawaii during the plantation era. And while I can imagine wanting to see the world being a motivation, the lecture doesn't refer to that, and the most Parkhurst 1911 article says about that is that in 1865 Hawaiians had, quote, sailed the Pacific in search of new realms for their nomad spirits, end quote. Um, Her 1865 dating coincides with the Native Hawaiian diaspora of the late 18th to 19th century migrations, Professor also mentions in Lecture 5. Their migration to the East Coast as whalers is possibly tied to the orthodox economics theory of labor use. Because as settlers moved west, immigrants filled the void they left behind. Parker's article relates that Hawaiians in Vernon rarely intermarry, quote, preferring to marry women of their own race, which, when coupled with the later details of fishing for trout and catfish, owning land, farming alfalfa, and working in dairies while still keeping, quote, all of their race identity, close quote, that all to me looks like cultural pluralism, or with the inclusion of mainland food, almost literally the melting pot view applies. However, one could argue there's ethnic resilience going on in Parker's article as she writes that, quote, civilization has changed them even less than the invasion of the white man in their own lands, and, quote, have kept most of their characteristics, end quote. So there's not a lot of acculturation. The quote Hawaiian village Parkhurst mentions, these Hawaiian migrants had set up in Vernon County with around 100 of them. Sounds a lot like an ethnic enclave, maintaining the social, economic, and emotional support Professor talks about in Lecture 5, reinforced by Parkhurst's assertions that the community is, quote, thriving, close quote, and, quote, where peace and content rule their world, close quote. I think Hawaiians are a colonized minority, except I can't say that they were a group that cleanly fit into slavery, indentured servitude, or debt slavery. Okay, and as far as plantation labor in Hawaii, the colonized minority use of labor applies with the economic and political power wielded by sugar companies and plantation owners in the 1860s. With Hawaiians either dying or going abroad for the gold rush or whaling, those companies recruited workers from abroad, and that to me is indicative of the world systems theory, since the sugar industry and its drawing of labor from a global pool happens in this open system, not just one way or two way. The sugar industry seems to put the pull in push-pull theory, having recruited in China, Puerto Rico, Portugal, and Japan, as Professor says in Lecture 5. In these cases, settlement and economic success seem to be the goals. If we're to stick strictly to the definition of adaptation as the social relationships and cultural interactions between immigrants and a, quote, native majority, you don't get much of that in Parker's article. But even with the ethnically segregated plantations Professor talks about in Lecture 5, we have the legacy of Pidgin English as just one example of the adaptations immigrants made to facilitate communication.